to be talking today about the free preludes of the French lute tradition. I think this is a very interesting area of investigation because they occupy the ground somewhere between free improvised composition and actual written down, carefully thought out composition. And I think they were probably written with a specific purpose in mind, which is to introduce the movements of the suite. The lutenists introduced the practice of necessity because you would have to tune the lute in the key of the piece you were going to play with these bass strings. They have to be tuned in G minor in this case. So it didn't make sense to tune the lute for every little piece as it changed key. So therefore, we would simply tune the lute ahead of time and play all the pieces in the same key, but different dances. Some later lute examples, in the 1630s, Ballard introduced pieces by Dufaut and Messengeau, which were based in the transitional tuning rather than the old tuning of the lute. And this is where the real history of the instrument that I'm talking about began. Later lute examples by the Gautiers, Mouton, Galop, Devise, have more rhythm written in them, and they're a little longer, a little bit more complex. These pieces also had an influence on keyboard composers, especially Louis Couperin, Chambonnier, and Leroux published preludes in this style. In the 18th century, arpeggiated preludes exist by Weiss, and he wrote little preludes at the beginning of his pieces and expected you to more or less use that as a basis of improvisation. Bach preludes, especially, I can think of examples in the cello suites, the second and third cello suites. There's a strong influence of the free French style lute prelude. And the French suites for harpsichord also have these kind of preludes, but written out. They should feel improvised, but they're actually composed. They have a kind of flexible, non-pulsatile rhythm. Quite often they have an inconsistent subdivision of the beat into 2s, 3s, 5s, and 7s. If you include ornamentation, you can keep that beat as long as you like. The placement of bass notes is a crucial question because obviously the bass notes of the lute are a prominent feature of its style. So it's natural we see a progression of bass notes moving downward into the bass of the lute. That would provide a kind of structural point. So the continual progression is kind of based in the earlier style of the Italian dance. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to devise a narrative what will make sense to the listener for you to sound as if the piece is improvised, but you're going to add ornaments to it, you're going to speed up and slow down, and it's going to seem very clever, but it's cleverly improvised, but you've actually worked out an interpretation in advance, which you've carefully practiced, but it sounds as if you just made it up. So I'll do that as soon as I get my lute in tune. Well, as Jimi Hendrix used to say, when I get it in tune, I'm going to weld it. And in my case, I'd have to glue it. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the piece is put together now, and we're going to try and see some of the features in the piece. I'm going to try and talk and play at the same time. I find that quite difficult, but that's why we're here today, to try to see some of the features in the piece, and it's one of the easiest ways to kind of lead you through the sound world that this piece represents. Right at the beginning, there's something which I call the nuncio. It's the announcement of the key. It's just a triad in G minor, an accord, arpeggio, and then there's some melodic movement forward, and the dominant, and then the seventh. Tonic again, dominant, once again the seventh, leading us into a sequence. Improvised. Dominant, but a trick. Melodic. Midpoint of the piece. A change of mode. G minor again. Dominant in first inversion. A series of chords, working up to the high note, dominant seventh, dominant pedal. So you can see I tried to add some elements there that really were improvised. I worked this out, of course, ahead of time, but I worked it out improvising the piece as I was practicing it, and then I included that in the performance. I think that's one of the ways that I'm trying to show that it is possible to make the piece sound fresh, vivid, lively, and that has a lot of relevance. It makes the piece relevant to life today, because it seems alive. That's early music today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the lutes I'm using, because I think that's interesting for a lot of people. I made these lutes, of course, and this is part of my exploration of the instrument. I feel that the kind of hands-on sensation of playing the lute leads to writing its music and then, of course, making the instruments. The latter part of the 1500s, they developed a kind of small bass lute, and they did it by elongating the body of earlier lutes. You can see that's a very longish instrument. And by lengthening it, of course, it makes the strings longer and lowers their pitch. So what they did was, instead of having the bridge at the 1/6 position, they moved it to the 1/8 position, changed the barring a little bit. And this lute, there's just a slightly less than a right angle joint there in the middle, and it has 7 courses. So what happened in a later period is that these lutes, which were made by German craftsmen working in Italy, in Padua, Bologna, Rome, Venice, they worked in small workshops. They were highly skilled at working with softwoods, and such as yew wood and, of course, spruce. And they were good at turning pegs and other skills required to make lutes. So they worked in a kind of small-scale workshop in which each person would specialize in a particular job, and they would produce lutes. 5, 6, 10 people would make lutes, and the business was handed down from father to son. So here's a Venetian lute made by Rielich, and this is a typical lute of the original instrument is 1641. So made in Venice, and this is a very big departure from the lute I just showed you. You can see that it's an example of mannerism. The profile in this dimension is very different from the flattened profile of that dimension. And there are many more ribs, and they're shaded hues so that it gives the impression of having more ribs than it actually has. You can see there's a tracery on the back of the peg box that's very characteristic of Venetian work, and the rose is also a tracery. So these are both examples of Byzantine influence, that is to say, the influence of the Levant, of what we now know, of course, as Turkey, in Venetian, because they traded a lot with these. So this is kind of a short string length lute. It has bass strings. There are 11 courses, but it kind of hasn't got the presence and the string length to be really forceful in performance. Although it is a nice lute. So what they did was they took those earlier bass lutes and they cut them. They would cut into the end block, the neck block, and they would keep the body and the soundboard and add a new neck and a new peg box and a new bridge. They would take off the top. They would take off the braces, plane it more thinly so that it had a characteristic thinner, more penetrating sound, which is suitable for this music because it kind of depends on single notes more than rapid lines of notes. And then they would add these bass strings. In this case, there are 11 courses, and they're tuned in the key. And you can hear that they're much more, there's a lot of richness in these low notes. And this is what drives the piece. So you can hear that in these preludes. I hope that's been interesting for you to know a little bit about the lutes as well as the music.